Welcome to AP Psychology. This first PowerPoint will give you an idea of the history, methods, and approaches psychology uses. Interest in the human mind goes back to ancient times, and one of the questions which has remained up to the present time, although in a slightly different form, is the idea of whether the mind and body are connected with one another, or if they are two distinct entities. Now, of course, this connects with the religious ideas of there being a spirit or a soul which survives after the body's death. Another crucial idea is whether or not we are each born as what might be called a blank slate. In other words, we are like pieces of paper on which experience writes its narrative, or whether we are born already with predispositions to certain kinds of behavior, which will inevitably show themselves through our lifetime. So as you can see on this chart, that, as I said before, interest in psychology goes back to very ancient times, from the ancient Hebrews through to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, up through the Middle Ages, from St. Augustine through to Descartes in the 17th century, and Locke in the 18th century. And you can see that debate about whether or not there's a blank slate or we mind and body are distinct is a debate that has continued to the present. However, psychology likes to consider itself to be a science, and as such, it needs to base its conclusions on experience, that is, on experiment and observation and other research techniques which can be verifiable by others who might be interested in the same topic and who want to see if the conclusions that a psychologist has come to are reasonable ones. So the first scientific approach to psychology was by a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. And you'll notice there are going to be a lot of German names for the first little bit of psychological history, who came up with a reaction time experiment at the University of Leipzig. And that should be Leipzig in 1879. A simple experiment, not very interesting by our standards, but still set the ball rolling for psychology as a science using the experimental method. Edward Titchener developed a system which he called structuralism, which essentially involved the subject reporting whatever came to his or her mind during a period of time. And functionalism focused on how behavioral processes enable an organism to adapt, survive, and flourish. And you can see the outlines of biological psychology in functionalism. Moving on, we have, well, as I said before, Wilhelm Wundt, German psychologist who, or a philosopher and physiologist actually, who developed or came up with the first truly experimental form of psychology. And we will be talking about, as time goes on, William James, Ivan Pavlov, Sigmund Freud was the person that a lot of people think about when it comes to particularly psychiatry, Jean Piaget, and psychology is defined as the science of behavior and mental processes, so anything that we do or think or dream or feel can be considered the province of psychology. One big issue in psychology is the so-called nature or nurture controversy. And the idea here is trying to determine the extent to which what we are born with, that is the genetic inheritance from our parents, determines our behavior, or whether it's the environment, our family, our friends, our access to media, our access to education, and so on, that ultimately determine the kind of person we become and how we will behave, and ultimately whether or not we will be successful in our lives. And we'll see that there's no simple answer to this issue in any area of psychology. But one thing we can conclude is that in most important areas of psychology, it is both nature and nurture determining our behavior. Now, continuing on with the more scientific approach to psychology, which has developed recently, psychologists have developed an interest in Darwinian biology, the theory of natural selection, or theory of evolution by natural selection, and have tried to apply it to psychology, pointing out that just as our physical bodies, our physical beings, have, through natural selection, developed certain traits, so it follows that our minds, through natural selection, have developed certain traits. So evolutionary psychologists would argue that certain fears we have, certain predispositions to the kinds of persons that we prefer in the opposite sex, in a heterosexual relationship, and so on, are things that were determined by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of natural selection. And you can see laid out here in handy form the basic perspectives of psychology, which you can take a moment to look at, and which is reproduced in your textbook. Psychology has several subfields, and when we divide these subfields, the two basic categories are basic research and applied research. Basic research occurs simply from the need or the want to know. For example, what is the connection between brain and mind? Is mind distinct from brain, or is the brain essentially the mind operating through extremely complex, almost incomprehensibly complex physical interactions among the brain cells? Developmental psychologists want to look at, for example, the extent to which a person's personality remains stable from birth to death. How much do we actually change in that period of time as a result of age, and how much do we remain the same? It's a basic question. It doesn't really have necessarily any immediate practical application, but it's just interesting for its own sake, because it tends to answer, or tries to answer, the question, to what extent are you through your whole life? And cognitive psychologists would like to study how we can perceive, think, and solve problems. And of course, this can be a great interest when, for example, it comes to the issue of intelligence, which we'll discuss in much more detail. Personality psychologists and social psychologists also conduct basic research, and once again, basic research arises from just the desire to answer a question which might not have any practical application, but is nice to know. Applied research takes psychology out into the real world and tries to make positive changes. For example, some psychologists work in industrial organizations where they try to advise management and the labor force on how better to organize the business so that everybody is more content, everybody can be happier. And of course, clinical psychologists, particularly in education, can help children who are having trouble in the classroom. Psychiatry is the specifically medical field of psychology. The essential difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist is that a psychiatrist, in the first instance, is a doctor. The person trains as a doctor and then specializes in psychiatry. And therefore, only the psychiatrist can prescribe medication for a psychological problem. A psychologist might be actually a better counselor, but is not permitted to prescribe medication. And therefore, if the psychologist is counseling an individual and decides that person might benefit from some medication, he or she would have to refer that person to a psychiatrist.